He had always been the kind of boss who exuded arrogance. Tall, thin, with slicked-back gray hair and tailored suits that cost more than my LA apartment rent. He liked to remind everyone who was in charge. His office, located on the 27th floor of a mirrored building in downtown LA, was buzzing with a constant frenzy. Cell phones ringing, heels scurrying in the hallways, printers spitting out million-dollar contracts. But despite the outward glamour, the environment was stifling to me. I was just a newly hired product engineer, full of ideas but no voice. My name was rarely mentioned. It was always "Hey, you," accompanied by an impatient snap of his fingers. One day, in the middle of an important meeting about a project I had designed myself, he interrupted the presentation to give me a bored look and say, "Oh, before I forget, pick up my suit from the dry cleaners on Melrose after work. And don't ruin it, it's Italian." My colleagues swallowed hard, looked away, and I felt my face burn. I, an electrical engineering graduate with a revolutionary prototype in my hands, was being reduced to a dry cleaner. But I swallowed my pride. I left early, picked up my suit and it was there, standing in line at the dry cleaners. That I had the epiphany that would change my life and lead my boss to pay me millions in royalties, years later. As I watched the steam rise from the machines, I noticed a bizarre detail. The way moisture dissipated could be replicated in my design for microwind turbines. It was the missing insight for the patent I had been secretly drafting. That same night, locked in my cramped Westlake studio, I feverishly scribbled diagrams, fueled by anger and cheap coffee. My boss, unbeknownst to me, had financed with his humiliating request the most creative moment of my life. The next day, I went to work with my chest puffed out with a determination no one could have guessed. As I sat at my desk, the secret project ticked in my mind like a ticking time bomb. I watched my boss walk the halls, issuing orders and fake smiles to important clients, completely unaware that the kid he'd sent to pick up a suit from the cleaners was about to change the clean energy market forever. For weeks, I maintained my impeccable routine, so as not to arouse suspicion. I showed up on time, accepted humiliating tasks, and smiled when he joked about how nice it was to have someone to run errands and make coffee. But at night, in my tiny apartment, I nurtured my revenge in the form of schematics, spreadsheets, simulations, and discreet contacts with patent attorneys. I couldn't afford to make a mistake. One misplaced comma could mean losing my intellectual property to that greedy corporation. When I finally filed my patent application with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, I felt a weight lifted from my shoulders. It was as if, for a moment, the thin air of Los Angeles had become pure. Still, I remained completely silent. I didn't want my boss to even dream of the gold mine I had just secured in my name. Continue to the next paragraph. As the days went by, he continued to treat me like his personal handyman. He would send me to fetch coffee 15 blocks away, pick up tickets to Lakers games, or bring flowers to his wife in Beverly Hills. Each task was a humiliating reminder of how little I was worth in his eyes. Little did he know that, on the inside, I was laughing at him. The patent began to gain traction in the market when a Silicon Valley startup discovered my patent and contacted me. They wanted to license the technology immediately, because what I had invented reduced the costs of microwind power generation by nearly 40%. I signed the first licensing agreement with my hands shaking not from fear, but from excitement. The advance check I received was more than my annual salary at my boss's company. Still, I kept going to work every day, smiling at him, taking stupid scoldings for spreadsheets that weren't even mine, just to savor the bittersweet taste of the secret I was keeping. When he finally found out, it wasn't from me. It was his lawyer, who walked into the meeting room looking like she had seen a ghost, holding a dossier with my name printed on dozens of pages. Continue to the next paragraph. He called me into his private office at the end of the workday, slammed the door shut, and stared at me as if he were calculating whether it was better to fire me or strangle me right there. The room was all glass, with a view of the blood-red sunset over Los Angeles, but at that moment it felt like a claustrophobic aquarium. "Why didn't you tell me?" was all he could stammer. His tone was not one of curiosity, but of pure panic. I explained calmly, with the coolness of someone who had been rehearsing this speech for months. I said that the invention was mine, developed after hours, with my own funds, and that the patent had already been duly registered. Sweat ran down his temple as he pressed the Mont Blanc pen against the glass of the desk. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Continue to the next paragraph. He tried to intimidate me. He threatened to sue me for having used knowledge obtained at the company. He ordered the legal department to prepare notifications, talked about breach of confidentiality, and astronomical compensation. I was ready for anything. My lawyer, a shark from Santa Monica who specialized in intellectual property, destroyed each of their arguments with the precision of a scalpel. There was no clause in my contract that bound me to creations made outside the corporate environment and outside of working hours. The project was indisputably mine. So, in desperation, he did what powerful men always do when they realize they have lost. He tried to buy my patent. He offered impressive figures at first glance, but far below the billion-dollar potential that I knew that technology would have. I politely refused, watching his face contort in a mixture of disbelief and hatred. He was not used to hearing no. The refusal sounded like a thunderclap in his head. The air felt heavy, charged with pent-up electricity. His jaw clenched so tightly that I could see the vein in his neck. He tried to offer me a token share, suggesting that it would be better to be with him than against him. I declined. I simply said that I preferred to keep my freedom. That night, I left the mirrored building with the feeling that he was watching me through the 27th floor window. Small and furious, as I walked away down the sidewalk, lit by the headlights of cars. Over the next few days, the mood in the office grew tense. Colleagues who had previously laughed loudly around my desk began to whisper, exchanging glances that seemed to say, "He's finished." I even found papers from HR mysteriously left on my chair, like veiled warnings. But I kept my composure, ignoring the fear gnawing at my stomach. I knew that this psychological game was his last resort to break me. Meanwhile, the Silicon Valley startup that had already licensed my patent invited me to a meeting in Palo Alto. Walking into that modern office, with its walls covered in futuristic idea boards, was like breathing fresh air after years of being in stuffy rooms of arrogance and hypocrisy. They talked about expanding, raising funds, using my technology in environmental rescue drones. I saw my future unfold before me like a clear horizon, without the shadow of my old boss hanging over every decision. Continue to the next paragraph. However, he did not give up easily. Without warning, he sent his lawyers to challenge the patent directly at the USPTO, claiming that I had used proprietary know-how acquired on the job. It was a tense few weeks, sleepless nights, my phone buzzing with notifications of lawsuits and legal responses. My lawyer dealt with each attack with surgical coolness, but I carried the anxiety in my skin. I began to lose weight, waking up in the middle of the night with a dry throat and the image of him staring at me, triumphant, in my nightmares. Still, each new attack of his only reinforced my conviction. I was not going to give in. I knew that if I gave up the patent, I would spend the rest of my life as a submissive employee, repeating the same routine of humiliation while he profited from my creative genius. The local press, smelling blood, began to publish short articles about the intellectual property conflict between promising LA inventor and powerful executive. His face appeared in small columns, always with that practiced smile that no one could convince anymore. Continue to the next paragraph. Then came the day of the preliminary hearing in federal court. My hands were cold as I sat next to my lawyer, watching the judge flip through the paperwork. His lawyer gave a long speech, full of empty flourishes, trying to paint a picture of me as an ingrate who had only managed to get this job done, thanks to the company's stimulating and resource-rich environment. When it was my representative's turn to speak, he got straight to the point, pointing out dates, records, emails sent from my personal computer, prototypes assembled in my apartment, receipts for parts purchased with my credit card. The argument was so solid that the opposing lawyer's face began to crumble halfway through the session. The judge, cold and meticulous, looked at us and announced that, preliminarily, he saw very strong evidence that the patent was exclusively mine, and that there would be no injunction preventing me from exploiting it until the case was concluded. In effect, that was a fatal shot to my boss's ambitions. Continue to the next paragraph. When I left the courthouse, the sun seemed brighter than ever. I had been receiving calls all day. Investors who had previously been cautious were now wanting to schedule immediate meetings. The tables had turned completely. My old boss, on the other hand, had become virtually invisible. He canceled trips, avoided events, locked himself behind thick doors and threatening secretaries. Then came the final blow. So ironic, it seemed written by some sadistic screenwriter. One of the companies most eager to license my patent for use in wind farms in Arizona was my former boss's biggest client. Their contract was conditional on the use of my technology. In other words, in order to continue to profit from that client, they would have to pay royalties directly to me. When that was official, I received my first depositor sum so large that it took me a while to process that it was real. I remembered the line at the dry cleaners, the smell of hot steam, the weight of the Italian suit in my arms. And for a moment, I savored the sweet, bitter taste of revenge served cold. Exactly the way it was meant to be. Money began to arrive in ever-increasing waves. Licensing, exclusivity contracts, small startups trying to adapt my patent to portable systems, large corporations exploring international agreements. Everything flowed with an almost frightening naturalness, as if the entire universe had decided to conspire in my favor after years of pushing me against cold walls. Meanwhile, my former boss was facing a silent storm. His shareholders were not happy to learn that future profits depended directly on someone he had despised, humiliated, and treated like a dry cleaner. The company's stock began to fluctuate. Internal rumors said that there were constant fights on the board, some directly blaming him for having lost control of such a valuable technological asset. He still tried to pose as confident, showing up at meetings with that same polite smile. But you could tell by his sunken eyes, by the nervous tick in his fingers that incessantly drummed on the table, that the facade was crumbling. On the other hand, I was sleeping better and better. I started waking up before my alarm, slowly preparing my coffee, enjoying the steam rising from the cup, like a hypnotic dance, free from the weight I had carried for so long. I even started planning short trips around the state, something that had previously seemed like a distant luxury. Continue to the next paragraph. One day, I received an unexpected invitation. A large renewable energy conference in San Diego wanted me to speak about innovation in wind microgeneration. I was overcome by teenage nervousness. I accepted, of course, but for days I mentally rehearsed what I would say, afraid of breaking down in front of hundreds of people. When I went on stage, however, something inside me calmed down. I saw attentive faces, cameras recording my every move, and I realized that my entire history, every humiliation, every sleepless night, every solitary cup of coffee in the cramped studio had prepared me for exactly this moment. I told about the insight in the laundromat, without mentioning names, only emphasizing the value of observing the world with curious eyes, even in the most banal places. I spoke about perseverance, about how protecting an idea can require more courage than developing it. When I finished, the applause was so long that I had to thank them several times before leaving the stage. Backstage, people from different countries approached me, wanting to collaborate, propose projects, even document my journey. Continue to the next paragraph. The final irony came a few months later, when I was invited to an exclusive event in Los Angeles to present new energy solutions to potential foreign investors. It was at a luxurious hotel in Beverly Hills, with large halls and chandeliers that looked like crystal waterfalls. I was there as the centerpiece, with my technology emblazoned on banners throughout the venue. As I walked through the foyer, my dark suit impeccably tailored, I caught a glimpse of a familiar figure. My former boss, standing near the bar, holding a glass of whiskey with the same arrogant air as always, but his body betraying the weight of defeat, slumped shoulders, a more prominent jowl, a lost look in his eyes. Our eyes met for a brief moment. He seemed to freeze, then turned his head away, feigning interest in something across the room. I didn't need to say anything. The silence between us was the most eloquent confession of all. Continue to the next paragraph. I returned home that night with a strange feeling, a mixture of victory and emptiness. I had everything I had ever dreamed of: financial freedom, professional recognition, proposals that allowed me to choose not only how much I would earn, but also how I wanted to live. Still, I found myself thinking about all the stolen hours, the moments I had failed to visit friends, the messages I had not answered because I was drowning in projects or suffocated by fear. The price of victory, I realized, is rarely printed in dollar signs. You carry it on your skin, in your eyes that age prematurely, in the memories that return uninvited in the early hours of the morning. Still, when I opened the door to my new loft in Santa Monica, the soft sound of the ocean coming through the windows, I felt like I had paid for something no amount of money could buy: the chance to decide my own destiny, without having to carry other men's suits. At that moment, I smiled to myself, certain that, despite the scars, I would do it all over again. The days began to take on an almost contemplative rhythm. I would wake up early and walk along the shore, feeling the salty smell of the Pacific invade my lungs. Sometimes I would stop at a small cafe and read reports on new advances that my patent was enabling in places I had never set foot, turbines in the Australian desert, microgrids in villages in Africa, drones that were bringing power to field hospitals in hurricane-ravaged areas of the Caribbean. The scope of what I had created became clearer, and oddly enough, it brought me a peace that no amount of money could ever provide. Still, there were nights when the past would catch me by the collar. I would dream of my old office, with the acrid smell of worn carpet mixed with my former boss's expensive perfume. I would wake up with my heart racing, my hands clenched into fists against the sheets. I would have to get up, walk around the loft, open the windows and let the wind hit my face to remember where I was. Even after I had won, the humiliation would remain like a stain that was hard to remove. But little by little I began to realize that this was also a form of revenge. He may have lost money, contracts and prestige, but I continued to carry some invisible scars that were only mine. Continue to the next paragraph. There was a small Thai restaurant in Venice Beach where I began to eat lunch regularly. The owner, a soft-spoken gentleman with a genuine smile, had no idea who I was. He served my favorite dish the same way every time, and asked politely how my day was going, without trying to impress or flatter me. It was a kind of comforting, almost medicinal anonymity. On one of those visits, I sat in a corner near the window and noticed someone from across the street watching me. He was wearing sunglasses, a business suit, and was holding a cell phone, but he wasn't talking to anyone. My first instinct was to think he was paranoid, but the figure remained there for too long. I got up, paid the bill, and when I left, there was no sign of the man. For days, I was on high alert, locking the door more carefully and checking back in the underground parking lots. My lawyer assured me that there was nothing more my former employer could do, that any attempt to intimidate or spy on me would result in a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against them. Still, fear is not a rational creature. He lodges wherever he wants, without asking permission. Continue to the next paragraph. Over time, that feeling began to fade. I received invitations to speak at universities, participated in panels on entrepreneurship, and even recorded a documentary for a streaming platform, telling how a single humiliating experience can become fuel for something transformative. During the recordings, I relived moments that I would have preferred to have left buried. The director asked me to describe the feeling of being treated like an unimportant personal assistant. I remembered the shame, the tightness in my chest, the metallic taste in my mouth. When the documentary was released, I received hundreds of messages from people who said they had been through similar situations, ideas stolen, merits diverted, public humiliation. There was something deeply saddening in knowing that my story was not rare, but also a twisted consolation. We were not as alone as we seemed. Continue to the next paragraph. A year after the hearing that sealed my fate, I learned from mutual friends that my former boss had been removed from his position by the board. There were rumors of mismanagement, embezzlement, and a quiet internal investigation. The company was still standing, but it was staggering, dependent directly on the contracts that had to be signed through my licenses. I felt neither euphoria nor base pleasure. It was more like watching an old building slowly crumble, brick by brick, until only dust remained where there had once been arrogance. Sometimes I wondered if it had all really been worth it, the sleepless nights, the anxiety attacks, the constant fear that a legal error would ruin me. But then I would look out the window of my loft at the sea, feel the wind blowing through my hair, and realize that there was something more than revenge that had motivated me. It was the right to live without chains, without having to bow my head to small men in expensive suits. That, I realized, was priceless and could not be compensated for. As time went by, I began to reorganize my life in an almost obsessive way. Every piece of furniture in the loft was replaced. Every old piece of clothing from the time when I still wore other people's suits was donated. I wanted to get rid of everything that smelled like that office, of that gray past that insisted on haunting my memory. I began to fill my days with new routines, diving lessons in Marina del Rey, casual encounters with people who had no idea what I had faced, dinners in distant neighborhoods just to feel that the world was bigger than the meeting rooms that had previously imprisoned me. Still, there were times when the silence weighed like concrete. Some nights I would find myself staring at the ceiling, thinking about what would have happened if I had accepted the first fat check that my former boss offered to buy my rank. I would probably be in some minor department, taking indirect orders from him, living in an illusion of stability while he fattened up dividends with something that had come from my mind. This possibility haunted me more than any real fear. Continue to the next paragraph. It was during this period that I accepted an invitation to attend an international conference in Tokyo. They wanted my opinion on the use of microturbines in dense urban areas, something that could drastically change Japan's energy landscape. When I landed there, I was overcome by an intense mixture of wonder and melancholy. The streets vibrated with signs, voices, and smells that I could not identify. I walked through cramped neighborhoods, with alleys that seemed like mazes, and for the first time in a long time I felt truly small, part of something gigantic and indifferent. During my talk, I spoke not only of the technical aspects of the patent, but also of what had motivated me to continue. I spoke of the small daily humiliations, of the jokes made in the office break room, of the psychological burden of being seen as disposable. The audience fell silent. When I finished, the applause was not euphoric, but seemed charged with something deeper, as if these people had understood a pain that transcends cultures. Continue to the next paragraph. When I returned to Los Angeles, I found a discreet envelope in my mailbox, with no logo, just my name printed on sturdy paper. Inside was a letter signed by my former boss's former lawyer. He informed me that his client had filed for liquidation of part of his personal assets to cover corporate debts, and that he would therefore have to rescind his last attempt to contest future royalties. It was, in practical terms, a silent surrender, a formal end to any threat that still hung over my work. I read and reread the document several times, feeling something that was neither joy nor triumph. It was a strange kind of mourning, as if an entire chapter of my life had officially closed and I had to say goodbye, even to the pain that had, in some ways, defined me for so long. I put the paper in a locked drawer, knowing that I would never destroy it, because it was concrete proof that I had survived. Continue to the next paragraph. In the midst of all this, I decided to resume something I had abandoned in the first months of the conflict: writing personal notes. They were not conventional diaries, but loose pages where I poured out fragments of thoughts, memories, and even imaginary conversations with the man who once dictated my destiny. In these pages, I did not seek revenge or revisit grudges. It was more like pulling out splinters that had remained under my skin. I wrote about the fear of failure, about the anguish of not being recognized, about the brutal loneliness that sets in when everyone seems to be rooting for your downfall. Little by little, these words began to ease me, as if by transferring them to paper I was exorcising them from my body. There were days when I cried silently, without knowing if it was out of sadness or because I finally had space to feel something other than pure survival instinct. When I finished, I closed the notebook and allowed myself to sleep in peace. At least until the next wave of memories came to visit me. Over time, my notes began to turn into something close to confessions. I wrote about the almost palpable weight of having one and, at the same time, having lost parts of myself that I would never recover. There were days when I would wake up and feel my heart hollow, as if the purpose that had driven me for so long had evaporated now that the enemy was definitively defeated. I began to frequent small second-hand bookshops around the city, hunting for used books, old editions, looking for stories that were not my own. I needed other people's stories to escape the labyrinth of my own head. I read Russian novels, Japanese chronicles, biographies of people who lived centuries before me and who, in some way, had known the same pain of being underestimated, exploited, betrayed. This silent communion with dead voices reconnected me to something broader than my old resentment. I discovered that my personal tragedy was not unique, and this strangely brought a form of consolation, albeit harsh, almost cold. Continue to the next paragraph. One late afternoon, I decided to revisit the building where it all began. I walked to downtown LA, watching the city pulse indifferently to my ghosts. When I arrived in front of the mirrored tower, I stood still for a few minutes, just looking at the revolving entrance through which I had entered so many times with a tight stomach, fearing the next humiliating command. I noticed new receptionists, security guards who wouldn't recognize me, executives in a hurry talking on their cell phones. I thought about going up to the 27th floor, just to see who now occupied the room where my old boss had sent me to fetch coffee and carry suits. But I didn't need to. There, standing on the sidewalk, I realized that there was nothing left in that building that could affect me. It was just concrete, glass and steel, as empty as his smile, in the last months before he was deposed. I turned around and walked to a small park nearby, sat on a bench and let the wind cover me like a silent cloak. For the first time, I felt that the cycle had truly closed. Continue to the next paragraph. Back in my loft, I began to devote more time to small projects that didn't involve profit, contracts, or courts. I began mentoring young engineers from local universities, reviewing prototypes, giving feedback on pitches they would present at incubators. Sometimes I would look at those anxious faces and see myself reflected in them, afraid of making mistakes, eager for validation. I made a point of listening to every detail, not just about the projects, but about the personal stories behind the ideas. Some worked double time to pay for college, others shared a tiny room with strangers. Each confession reminded me of where I came from and reinforced a silent certainty: no talent should be crushed by the vanity of mediocre men who only knew how to exploit the work of others. Teaching, mentoring, and listening became for me not only a gesture of reparation to the world, but a way of healing my own invisible wounds. Continue to the next paragraph. On a rainy night, I sat down to reread all the notes I had been accumulating over the last few months. The pages were stained in some places, perhaps from coffee, perhaps from old tears I didn't even remember shedding. Each word seemed to pulse with the weight of the years I had left behind. I noticed how my tone had changed over time. In the first texts, there was pure anger, an almost cruel desire for destruction. Later, there were passages full of fear, insecurity, paranoia. Later, cold, almost philosophical reflections emerged, trying to understand what it means to triumph when the price is having scars that no one sees. I closed the notebook and took a deep breath, as if finishing a long ritual. I didn't feel immediate relief, but a gradual calm began to invade me, an inner recognition that I had lived through it all and was still standing. Perhaps this was the true act of revenge against the past, to continue existing, without bowing down, without surrendering to the silence imposed by those who once tried to crush me. As the days went by, the city began to feel different to me. It wasn't just the incessant traffic or the bittersweet smell of food trucks scattered around busy corners. It was as if I had shed my skin, and because of that, everything around me had acquired a different texture. I walked the streets of Santa Monica like a man who no longer had to prove anything to anyone. Some people, recognizing my face from the documentary, approached me to tell me that my story had inspired them not to give up on their own projects. I thanked them with a restrained smile, but inside I felt something deeper and harder to explain. It wasn't pride, nor was it vanity. It was a bittersweet feeling, a kind of mourning for the time I would never get back, even if I had one. Because winning, I discovered, carries with it the silent obligation to continue existing after all the war is over. Continue to the next paragraph. One particularly cold morning, I received an unexpected call. It was the legal assistant from the office who had defended my patent tooth and nail years before. She wanted to tell me that my former boss's company had finally declared bankruptcy. The assets were being squandered, and part of the building that housed the conference room where I had been belittled so many times would be auctioned off in the coming weeks. I listened to it all in silence, while the sound of the sea crashing against the pier's pillars drifted in through the window. When I hung up, I stood there, holding my cell phone as if it still weighed a ton. Then I put the phone down on the table, walked out onto the balcony, and took a deep breath. I felt no pleasure in its fall, only a strange sense of closure. It was like watching the end of a long, exhausting play. The curtains fell, the lights went out, and there was no one left to applaud or boo. Continue to the next paragraph. That night, I slept soundly, without disturbing dreams, without waking up gasping in the middle of the night. When I woke up, I realized that there was something different about me. It was as if he had removed from his shoulders an invisible backpack that had been carrying stones for all those years. I made my coffee slowly, watched the steam rise, and realized that for the first time in a long time, that simple gesture was not loaded with metaphors. It was just coffee, just heat, just aroma. I didn't need to remember the laundry, the day when everything began to change. For the first time, that was stored in a safe compartment of my past, without spilling over into the present. I felt my body relax in an almost childlike way, as if I could finally live without constantly looking back, afraid that someone would appear to take what was mine. Continue to the next paragraph. A few days later, I accepted an invitation from a local university to give a short talk to engineering students. I entered the packed auditorium with no script, just a few key words scribbled on a crumpled piece of paper. When I took the microphone, I noticed the attentive faces, the shining eyes, the cell phones raised to record. I spoke of what no one usually talks about, of the late nights when I wondered if I was being foolish for resisting, of the days when I left work feeling smaller than the man who came in that morning. I said that the real fuel was not hatred, but the stubborn refusal to die anonymously with something great trapped inside me. When I finished, a deep silence spread, followed by an applause that was not loud, but seemed to come from the depths of each person there. I left that auditorium with the certainty that, in the end, everything I endured served a purpose greater than simple revenge. It served to prove that no humiliation, no matter how cruel, can definitively bury a spirit that chooses to fight. Time followed its course. Relentless as always, and without asking permission, it began to place a safe distance between me and the man I once was. I began to find pleasure in small routines without the urgency of proving anything to anyone. I discovered trails in the nearby mountains, where I could walk for hours, listening only to the sound of the wind pushing the dry leaves. On these walks, I often found myself remembering tiny details of the old office, the acidic smell of printers burning toner, the sound of heels of hurried secretaries, the arrogant shine of Swiss watches on the wrists of executives who looked at me as if I were disposable. But over time, these memories began to lose their sharpness, like photographs overexposed to the sun. They became shadows, distant noises, incapable of hurting. I then realized that the real victory had not been the money, nor the royalties, nor even seeing his empire crumble. The real trophy was this: being able to walk without feeling my chest constricted by anger or fear. Continue to the next paragraph. I traveled again, but this time without corporate goals, without pitch decks, without networking dinners. I went to Lisbon, sat in old cafes, watched yellow trams climbing hills while I wrote fragments of my own story in a simple notebook, just for me. Then I boarded a plane to Istanbul, where I lost myself in endless markets, full of spices, fabrics, and voices that fought for every crack in the air. No one there had any idea who I was or what I had achieved. And this anonymity was a gift as valuable as any contract I had signed. I slept in modest hotels, chatted with street vendors, let time slip by without planning the next minute. During those days, I realized that I was relearning to exist without the armor of distrust. Without the rigid armor that I had needed to wear for so long to avoid succumbing. It was like relearning to be human, stripped of the thick skin that hatred and pride carve. Continue to the next paragraph. When I returned to Los Angeles, I found my home exactly as I had left it, but something in me had changed irreversibly. I began to refuse unnecessary meetings, contracts that would tie me down to suffocating routines, or projects that seemed to only repeat the cycle that had destroyed me before. I preferred to accept small challenges that gave me space to create, test, and fail without the spotlight. I began to get involved in community initiatives to bring clean energy to underserved neighborhoods. Something that didn't generate headlines or spectacular profits, but carried a different weight, denser, more real. When I saw children turning on lights in makeshift community centers, I felt a kind of joy that didn't resemble euphoria. It was a gentle, almost silent contentment that spread slowly, without fanfare, but that remained there even after days. Continue to the next paragraph. On a rainy afternoon, I sat down to reread old contracts, drafts of the first versions of the project that now paid for a large part of my livelihood. There were feverish scribbles, hastily jotted down dates, small calculations made in the margins, all imbued with an almost sickly urgency. As I leafed through those papers, I saw myself as a man on the verge of collapse, clinging to the only thing that could save him from oblivion. For a moment, I felt compassion for that old me. It was an almost brotherly recognition. I understood his desperation, his loneliness, the feeling of walking a tightrope over an infinite abyss. I closed the folder carefully, as if it were guarding fragile relics, and promised myself that I would never return to that state of emotional exhaustion. If I had to fight again, I would fight, but I would not let the battle consume me to the point of forgetting who I am when I am not trying to survive. The weeks became a quiet, almost numbing territory. The phone rang less frequently, urgent emails became rare, and nights were filled with random reading or music that transported me to a time when none of that existed. Sometimes I would catch myself closing my eyes, allowing old memories to come like calm waves, without the violence they used to have. I would mentally revisit the small laundromat on Melrose, the steam rising lazily, the hum of the machines turning as I, an underappreciated engineer, held my boss's suit between my fingers that trembled with anger. This time, though the memory was not fraught with bitterness, but with a kind of twisted gratitude. Had he not humiliated me so blatantly, I might never have felt the fierce urge to prove myself. It was this wounded pride that drove me through the night, that made me draw circuits and diagrams on the coffee-stained table in my cramped studio. Continue to the next paragraph. There was a cruel paradox in all this. I owed him the initial spark that sustained my life today, but at the same time he had been the fuel that fueled my desire for independence. It was a vicious cycle that only ended when I finally saw him bankrupt. His company ruined, his name dragged through the mud of the financial market. Even so, I did not celebrate it with fanfare. Inside me, there hovered an almost respectful silence for everything that was destroyed so that I could exist the way I do today. It was not about pity, I would never feel that for someone who treated me like a servant, but about a mature acceptance that there is no victory without rubble, and that sometimes this rubble also carries parts of our own soul. That is why I continued walking carefully, as if treading on sacred ground, aware that each free step I take today was bought with pain that I still hold deep inside. Continue to the next paragraph. I decided to resume the practice of writing letters, but not to send them. They were letters addressed to myself in past versions. To the frightened young man who broke out in a cold sweat every time he heard his name called in the hallway. To the anxious engineer who trembled before graphs and balance sheets for fear of making a mistake. To the nearly broke man who, by a hair's breadth, almost agreed to sell his patent just so he wouldn't have to face another day of contempt. I wrote to say that he had held on, that he had survived not only the hatred of others, but also his own fear of being irrelevant. And that, despite everything, he still existed, breathing fresh air. Sleeping without the weight of moral debts, waking up without having to submit to petty orders. As I finished each letter, I felt a strange lightness run through my chest, as if I were finally sewing together parts of my past that had been frayed for so long. Continue to the next paragraph. One day, I received an unexpected visit from an old colleague from that office. We weren't exactly friends. We had a polite relationship, based on the politics of fear that hung over all of us at that time. He arrived with a nervous expression, restless eyes that searched my loft as if expecting to find hidden cameras or microphones. She sat in the armchair in front of the window and took a while to say anything. When she finally did, she confessed that she was tired, exhausted by the toxic culture that still persisted in similar companies. She told stories of other young people who now occupied the position that was once mine, subjected to small, everyday acts of violence that undermined their self-esteem in an almost invisible way. As I listened, I felt a lump form in my throat. Not for myself, but for everyone who was still going through the same cycle that I once knew so well. I promised to help him if he wanted to leave, to introduce him to contacts, to guide him in patenting his own ideas before someone more powerful did. He left relieved, and I was left alone in the silence of the apartment, reflecting on how certain pains, even after being overcome, continued to echo through other voices, in other corridors, in other names that I may never know. After that encounter, I spent days mulling over stories that weren't exactly mine, but that echoed inside me as if they were. I remembered faces erased by time, colleagues who laughed at cruel jokes just so they wouldn't become the next target, talented people who disappeared from the office without explanation, replaced by new names on the extension, as if they were defective parts replaced in a merciless machine. There was something deeply sad about this silent replacement. It was then that I found myself wondering if, deep down, my old boss wasn't just the visible face of an entire system, designed to crush any spark that threatened to light up outside the established lines. Maybe he was just the end product of a chain of vanities, fears, and ambitions that fed off each other until they became almost autonomous monsters. Even so, that didn't absolve him. He chose to be an accomplice. He multiplied the small cruelties with pleasure. He exercised power as if he savored every crumb of someone else's submission. Continue to the next paragraph. I started attending lectures by other inventors, people who were creating solutions to problems so far removed from my own that it was almost comforting to listen. I saw presentations about robots that mimicked the swimming of stingrays, irrigation systems powered by climate intelligence, prototypes for low-cost orthoses that could restore movement to children in poor regions of the planet. The sparkle in the eyes of those engineers reminded me of what had once been in my own, before all the war began. I realized that my greatest fear now was no longer being humiliated or robbed, but letting bitterness make me incapable of being enchanted. The burden of successful revenge, I discovered, is that it risks calcifying the heart. That is why I began to force myself to feel, to expose myself, to talk to people who had no idea of the legal battles that had once consumed me. Each new dialogue was like a slow polishing of the hard layers left by hatred. Continue to the next paragraph. One Sunday morning, I went for a walk and ended up stopping at a small neighborhood festival. Colorful stalls sold crafts, street musicians improvised crooked but lively solos. I saw children running with balloons, couples hugging, old people sitting on benches sharing peaceful silences. There, no one was interested in patents, lawsuits, or royalties. That hit me hard. All the brutal machinery that had almost destroyed me did not exist in that simple part of the city. I sat in a corner, ordered a very weak coffee, and just watched the action, as if it were a silent film projected just for me. I thought about how I had spent years believing that the only way to prove myself was to triumph over those who tried to belittle me. Now I saw that there were other types of victories, quieter, less dramatic, but perhaps infinitely more valuable. Continue to the next paragraph. When I got home that day, I looked at myself in the mirror for several long minutes. I was no longer the same young man I had been before. There were fine lines at the corners of my eyes, strands of lighter hair scattered across the top of my head. But there was also something serene about my face, an absence of that constant terror of failure or exposure. I ran my hand over my face, felt the rough texture of my beard, and for the first time, I didn't associate this image with weariness or defeat. It was simply the honest portrait of someone who had survived something that could have crushed any less stubborn spirit. Later, I sat on the couch with my notebook and wrote a few lines for the future. I promised that no matter what came, I would not allow myself to become like the person who had once hurt me. I promised that I would continue to help young inventors protect what they created, even if the world insisted on trying to buy them cheap or silence them with pats on the back. This silent and solitary commitment felt like the only true conclusion to my entire story. The following months were marked by a strangely light, almost monastic routine. I started waking up before sunrise, making my coffee in silence and watching the sky change tone from deep blue to a soft orange that slowly spread across the city from the balcony. Sometimes I caught myself taking deep breaths just to feel the air coming in and out slowly, as if my body was finally ready to exist without that constant knot in my stomach. The freedom I had acquired came at a high price, not only in sleepless nights or endless lawsuits, but mainly in invisible scars that continue to hurt from time to time, like bones complaining about the change in the weather. But I no longer feared them. I learned to live with these marks, like someone who carries stories engraved on their skin, painful memories that prove that I survived what many would not have endured. Continue to the next paragraph. One afternoon, I received a short message from an unknown number. It was from a young engineer who had attended one of my lectures and wanted advice on how to register an idea without being swallowed up by predatory investors. I arranged to meet for coffee, not expecting much more than a technical conversation. But when the young man arrived, I noticed the same anxious gleam in his eyes that I once had. He spoke too quickly, mumbling sentences, and feared that his own passion for the project could become a vulnerability exploited by someone more experienced. I listened patiently, asked practical questions, pointed out gaps in his business plan, and suggested contacts for specialized lawyers. When he finished, he shook my hand so tightly that I felt my heart tighten in my chest. Here was a living piece of what I had been, and helping this stranger felt like a cosmic adjustment, a subtle way of rebalancing the universe that had so often tilted against me. Continue to the next paragraph. Back in my loft, I walked slowly through the large rooms, feeling the cold floor beneath my feet. I remembered when everything I had fit into a cramped studio, with wires scattered across the floor, improvised circuits and sketches stuck to the wall, like prayers. The contrast hit me almost violently, not because of the luxury or the current comfort, but because of the immense distance between the man who was there and the almost broken boy who sweated through endless nights. I sat on the sofa, closed my eyes and let this distance pass through me completely, without resisting. I understood, with an almost painful clarity, that all that silent revenge against my former boss had left something inside me permanently altered. It wasn't just the victory or the money that changed my trajectory, but the raw awareness of how deep I had to go to come out the other side. Continue to the next paragraph. One night, I dreamed that I was back in that cold office on the 27th floor. The gray carpet, the glass walls, the muffled sound of the printers made up the same scene as before. But there was one difference. I was carrying nothing in my hands. No suits, no coffee, no folders. I was just standing there, looking straight at the chair where he used to sit. The chair was empty, slowly rotating, as if someone had just picked it up in a hurry. I woke up with my heart racing, but not out of fear. It was a strange, almost curious acceleration, as if something inside me finally recognized that space, physical and symbolic, no longer had an owner. His power over me had died, not only because of financial collapse or moral ruin, but because my mind, my body, my spirit, were no longer hostages to that dynamic of subservience. From that dream on, something subtle changed in me. I began to revisit old memories without feeling like I was entering a minefield. It was like opening a closet full of dusty boxes. Some contained small tragedies, others only ridiculous embarrassments, but they all belonged to a story that, whether I liked it or not, was mine. I began to remember more clearly the first day I walked into that company, anxious, carrying my recent diploma as if it were a shield capable of protecting me against the cynicism of the world. I remembered the childish vanity I felt when I wore my first badge, the small, silly pride of shaking hands with colleagues and telling them my job title, as if that were enough to legitimize me. Only later did I realize how ready that environment was to devour exactly that kind of youthful enthusiasm, transforming passion into fear, curiosity into servitude. Still, I did not deny who I was. Without that naive boy, there would be no man who could now take a deep breath without feeling heavy in his chest. Continue to the next paragraph. I began to dedicate myself to writing not just fragments, but entire chapters about everything I had experienced. I had no intention of posting them, nor of showing them to anyone. It was a brutally honest exercise, where I did not polish sentences to sound noble or victorious. I admitted my mistakes, my fits of pride that bordered on arrogance, the moments when I almost became as cruel as the man who exploited me. I wrote about the times when I imagined his downfall in almost sickening detail, mentally savoring every humiliation he might suffer. Recognizing these instincts embarrassed me, but it also freed me. Because, in the end, I didn't know what to do with so much anger other than transform it into work. And it was this work, obsessive, exhausting, but deeply mine, that built the bridge to the other side. Away from that silent war where there were only two destinies, to crush or to be crushed. Continue to the next paragraph. As the days passed, my writing became more relaxed. I began to record small observations of everyday life that had nothing to do with courts, contracts, or patents. I noted the way the afternoon light fell on the living room floor, forming golden rectangles that slowly migrated until they disappeared. I wrote about the sound of birds landing on the balcony railing and seeming to discuss urgent matters among themselves, completely oblivious to my story. I described the serene face of a street vendor I saw one morning, arranging ripe fruit with an almost devout care, as if each apple were a small treasure. These fragments anchored me in the present, kept my thoughts from slipping back into the cold conference rooms or the suffocating weight of the lawsuits that once occupied every crevice of my mind. Continue to the next paragraph. One sleepless night, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the almost completely dark room. Through the window came the distant sound of tires crossing wet avenues, occasional fragments of horns and laughter that came from who knows where. I thought about everything I had to go through. The choices I had made, some right, some regrettable, but all inescapably mine. There was no way to separate victory from loss, nor freedom from solitude. I understood then that life rarely delivers rounded or morally comfortable endings. What it gives, at most, are brief moments of clarity where you understand that, despite everything, you are still alive, breathing, capable of feeling some form of tenderness for the world. It was with this thought that I lay down again, closed my eyes, and, for the first time in a long time, fell asleep without being haunted by ghosts of corporate corridors, rude voices, or threatening contracts. It was just me, alone in the dark, finally at peace with the fact that I had been forged in fire and then learned, with painful patience, how to become human again. The following days were marked by an almost disconcerting serenity. I woke up slowly, drank my coffee and watched people pass by on the sidewalk, each one carrying worries I would never know. There was something liberating about this relative anonymity. After so many years of being the center of battles, tense meetings, and small headlines in business newspapers, it was a relief to no longer carry the weight of expectation. I began to frequent a small bookstore near the pier, a stuffy place with unstable stacks of used volumes, the strong smell of aged paper clinging to my nostrils. The owner rarely spoke, limiting himself to indicating the shelves with a vague movement of his hand. There, among forgotten biographies and old novels, I found refuge from any trace of toxic ambition. I didn't need to prove anything by leafing through pages stained by the fingers of strangers. I just had to be there, breathe, and let other people's stories fill the space that had previously been dominated by painful memories. Continue to the next paragraph. Sometimes I would walk to the pier in the late afternoon just to feel the wind blow hard on my face, messing up my hair and forcing me to close my eyes for a moment. That salty breeze seemed to carry with it a force capable of sweeping away the last shadows of the resentful man I once was. I would stand there, listening to seagulls scream, watching tourists take pictures, old fishermen laugh hoarsely as they checked their lines. Everything was so unrelated to my story, so indifferent to the pain I once thought was enormous, that it brought me an almost childlike relief, as if the world were reminding me, gently but firmly, that my personal saga was nothing more than a microscopic in an immense mosaic that does not depend on me to keep turning. Continue to the next paragraph. One night, while going through old notes, I found a note folded between the pages of the brown notebook I had been using when it all started. It was just a list of trivial tasks. Buy extra screws, check the rotor weld, get the report to the boss by Friday. But what struck me was the anxious way the words were written, the slightly slanted stroke as if the pen was being pushed for fear of making a mistake. I held the piece of paper for a few minutes, trying to mentally recall exactly what it had felt like to be that man. Tense, vulnerable, ready to bow at any sign of displeasure from upstairs. I didn't feel contempt for him. Instead, there was a quiet, almost painful compassion for the one who had had to endure so much to get to where I am now. Continue to the next paragraph. I met up with the young engineer I had helped months earlier again. He wanted to thank me personally for introducing me to the right lawyer, who was already working on registering his patent. We spoke in a cafe lit by light bulbs hanging from bare wires. The floor covered in cracked tiles that told a story of intense use, real life. He spoke with a sparkle in his eyes, describing not only the invention but the purpose behind it, the almost naive desire to make something that mattered. I remained silent for the most part, letting him pour that lively urgency over the table. When we said goodbye, I realized that there was something new inside me, not pride, not nostalgia, but a kind of almost sacred tranquility, knowing that the cycle was moving forward in other hands. If the world still had room for this flame, then perhaps everything I had endured had, after all, been worth some meaning that went beyond my small personal triumph. That same week, I received an unexpected invitation to speak at a symposium on ethics and innovation. The event would bring together researchers, small inventors, specialized lawyers, and even psychologists interested in the emotional impact of large corporate disputes. I hesitated before accepting. I wasn't sure if I wanted to put my story back in the spotlight, reopening doors that I had struggled to close. But there was something almost therapeutic in the possibility of transforming a path marked by humiliation and fear into a learning experience for others. I went on stage without notes, with only the raw memory of what I had experienced. I spoke slowly, choosing each word as if walking on whetstones, careful not to slip into old resentment. I told of the first day I was reduced to a laundry messenger, of the insight that emerged amid the strong smell of steam and soap, of the long nights filled with anxious calculations. Then I recounted the weight of the lawsuits, the icy fear of losing everything, the bitter victory that left so much dust behind. When I finished, the silence was so thick that for a moment I feared I had struck the wrong tone. But then came the applause, not explosive, but prolonged, filled with something close to gratitude. Continue to the next paragraph. After the event, some people approached me to share discreet confidences. A gray-haired man, his voice cracking, said that for years he had kept an invention in the back of a drawer for fear of being swallowed up by ruthless investors. A young woman held a folder against her chest as if it were a shield. She confessed that she had almost given her idea to a multinational company that promised the world but only wanted her name removed from the project. I listened to each story slowly, trying to offer something more than practical advice. I told them what I would have liked to have heard when I was in that position, that the courage to protect what is yours is not born ready, but is honed by the same trembling hands that sign documents, make prototypes, and send hesitant emails, and that in the end, even if the price was high, I would still choose to fight so that my name would be there, indelible, on the patent that would change the course of so many things. Continue to the next paragraph. When I got home that night, I sat on the living room floor with my back against the couch. Something I used to do on the worst days of anxiety, when the fear of losing everything made me feel small. Only this time there was no fear. It was like visiting an old scar, running my finger over it curiously, without feeling pain. I closed my eyes and imagined my old office, the carpet, the muffled voices, the sound of the heavy doors closing behind me. But now the scene was devoid of threat. It was just a place, and I no longer belonged there or to the role I played there. I spent a long time breathing, allowing the memory to dissolve until it was just a blur, without the cruel clarity it used to have. When I opened my eyes, the room was plunged into such peaceful silence that for a moment, I thought time had stopped just to give me the chance to finally understand what it was like to be free. Continue to the next paragraph. The next morning, I woke up before the sun and went for a walk through the still empty streets. The city slept in its silent routines, lit streetlights casting pale halos over damp sidewalks. I smelled fresh bread coming from a bakery that was just opening and let myself be guided by this simple, almost childlike aroma. I went in, ordered a coffee and a piece of cake, sat down near the window and watched the sky slowly lighten. There was something deeply healing in witnessing this daily ritual, so banal, and yet so essential. I thought about how many small moments I had failed to live fully because I was obsessed with contracts, deadlines, fears, revenge. There, biting into a piece of cake that was too moist, I felt that I was finally learning to inhabit the present without it being just a corridor to an anxious future. It was little, but it was honest. And perhaps that was precisely what gave real weight to the victories I had carried with me up until that point.